Commas. Other areas of agreement. Again, it is unlikely that you would break a widely accepted rule if you put a comma after every introductory element. Here are other guidelines that are widely accepted. 1. You must use a comma if leaving it out could cause serious misreading of a sentence. If you leave out the comma, there are times when the reader cannot tell if a word is the last part of the introductory element or if it is the subject of the whole sentence. When eating, the cat purrs loudly. While Anne was bathing, the telephone rang. In the first sentence, you might think somebody ate the cat, and in the second, it might seem that Anne gave her phone a bath. Although both of the elements are short, commas are needed to prevent misreading. When eating, the cat purrs loudly. While Anne was bathing, the telephone rang. 2. Even people who prefer that commas be used sparingly tend to agree that long introductory elements require commas. As noted earlier, there is no standard definition of what is long, but clearly sentences such as the following need a comma to let readers know where the main part of the sentence begins. Although Mark Twain wrote several lengthy novels during his distinguished career, he was granted a patent for a book that contained no words at all, entitled Self-Pasting Scrapbook. Having been taught to use a comma after most introductory elements in a sentence, Jerome rarely had to consult a grammar book on the issue. Summary. When deciding if you should use a comma after introductory element, consider the following. An introductory element can be easily recognized because they can almost always be moved to another position in the sentence. Most grammar handbooks written for general purposes state that it is never wrong to use a comma after an introductory element. Nonetheless, some people assume otherwise. So it is wise to determine the preferences of your readers, business, or organization. If in doubt, use commas after introductory elements of all types. Definitely use a comma when it is needed to prevent confusion or when the element is long, 5 words or more. It is optional to use a comma after short introductory clauses and prepositional phrases. But again, it is simpler and more consistent to use commas after every introductory element. Commas with adjective clauses. An adjective clause is a group of words used together to describe a person, place, or thing. Adjective clauses often begin with who, whom, whose, which, or that, as seen in the 4th example that follows. Sometimes these words can be deleted, though they are understood to be there. We need a photocopier that will not break down twice a week. Edwin Booth, who was the brother of man who shot Abraham Lincoln, once saved one of Lincoln's sons from being run over by a train. I saw a woman who I once dated. I saw a woman I once dated. In each of the 4 sentences above, the underlined clause describes a noun, a photocopier, Edwin Booth, or a woman. Thus, each clause is a single unit that functions as an adjective. Adjective clauses are sometimes called relative clauses. The 2 terms mean exactly the same thing. What's the problem? As illustrated in the preceding example, some adjective clauses are separated from the rest of the sentence with commas, while others are not. This is a complicated issue because it rests on the specific nature of each sentence and what the writer assumes is essential in order for readers to understand the sentence. The punctuation decision seems particularly subjective because ultimately it comes down to what the writer and reader consider to be essential information. Avoiding the problem. Use a comma to set off an adjective clause only when it does not contain information that helps to identify the person, place, or thing being described. If the noun or pronoun being described by the clause is specific, then usually the clause does not contain important information. Use a comma when this noun or pronoun being described is already specific and clear. Using commas with adjective clauses. Normally, the punctuation decision is not difficult if you keep the preceding tip in mind. Just look at the noun or pronoun being described by the clause. This noun or pronoun will usually appear immediately before the adjective clause. If this noun or pronoun has already been made specific for readers, then the clause is merely giving a little additional information. Adjective clauses are underlined in the following. My mother, who lives in Seattle, calls me every day. I drove to Ralph's hardware store, which is open on Sundays. In the first sentence, the word mother is already made specific because of the adjective my, so you do not need the underlined clause. You know whose mother is involved, and the fact that she lives in Seattle is some additional tidbit. If we can assume that there is only one Ralph's hardware store, then similarly, the adjective clause in the second example is not needed in order to know which store the writer has in mind. In short, a non-essential adjective clause is set off from the meat of the sentence. It is non-essential if the reader does not need it to determine which person, place, or thing the writer has in mind. An error would occur if commas were not used to set off a non-essential adjective clause, as in this example. Dr. Doolittle, who has been my physician for years, has asked me not to come back. The clause modifies a term, Dr. Doolittle, that is already specific and clear. Such an error can be easily corrected by inserting commas. Dr. Doolittle, who has been my physician for years, has asked me not to come back. This example, noted already, might seem more difficult to punctuate. Edwin Booth, who was the brother of the man who shot Abraham Lincoln, once saved one of Lincoln's sons from being run over by a train. The adjective clause is describing Edwin Booth and does include important information in the sense that most people do not know who Edwin Booth is. Even though the clause seems vital, the noun Edwin Booth is still so specific that the adjective clause is not essential. An adjective clause might contain important facts or details, but the key is usually whether the noun or pronoun is already specific. Such is the case with this sentence, so the writer must use commas. Grammar trivia, the Oxford comma. The term Oxford comma refers to a comma used right before the coordinating conjunction at the end of a list, as in small, great, and beautiful. But it is so named not because Oxford University Press invented it. It formally approved it as its own standard, and its prestige led to other people adopting it, because Oxford did so. The first endorsement by a major style guide had actually occurred around 1906, although it had already been in use before that endorsement. No one definitely knows who invented the Oxford comma, but it certainly was not Oxford. Adjective clauses that do not need commas. As stated earlier, do not use a comma when the clause is essential for helping readers. Identify the noun or pronoun being described. Again, consider whether the person, place, or thing being modified has already been sufficiently identified. Is the noun or pronoun general enough to require additional identifying information? If so, the adjective clause is too important to separate from the word it describes. We hired a lawyer whose firm specializes in mass litigation. Which lawyer? I have something that I need to discuss with you. What's something? Errors occur when the writer uses commas with adjective clauses that are essential for identifying the noun or pronoun being modified. The person who has borrowed the company van needs to return the vehicle at once. The term person is much too vague without the clause. It's not just any person who must return the vehicle, but the one who borrowed it. Use commas to set off adjective clauses only if the word being described is sufficiently specific and clear. As you can see, correcting this error is simple. Just leave out the commas. The person who has borrowed the company van needs to return the vehicle at once. Sometimes it just depends. Every now and then, the word being modified by the adjective clause could be sufficiently specific by itself or not. The matter depends on the larger situation beyond the sentence. Consider this sentence. My son, who is a stamp collector, is at a convention in Tulsa. Are commas needed? It depends on how many sons the writer has. If there's only one, the term my son is already specific, for it can only mean one thing. Accordingly, the sentence would need commas to separate the non-essential adjective clause from the rest of the sentence. My son, who is a stamp collector, is at a convention in Tulsa, if there's only one son. But if the writer has more than one son, then my son is not clear. Thus, the adjective clause is now essential for us to understand which son the writer has in mind. Leave out commas when a clause is this essential. My son, who is a stamp collector, is at a convention in Tulsa, if there are two or more sons. The tip discussed earlier tells you whether to use a comma or not. Use a comma with an adjective clause only if the clause is not essential for identifying the person, place, or thing being described. With some sentences, though, you must consider the larger context and intention to determine how clear the noun or pronoun is. Summary. An adjective clause is a group of words that act together to describe a previous noun or pronoun. Use commas with adjective clauses only when the noun or pronoun is sufficiently specific and clear. Commas with adverb clauses. It might be easier to consider a few examples of adverb clauses before reading the complex definition. Adverb clauses underline. I must leave before the party ends. When Nora wants to sing, we hide. The movie E.T. was banned in Sweden because it showed parents acting hostilely toward their children. We decided to travel by car to Idaho, even though it will be a 10-hour drive. As the above examples show, an adverb clause has the following characteristics. 1. It is a group of words that must include a subject and verb, even though the adverb clause cannot stand by itself as a complete sentence. 2. An adverb clause begins with a subordinating conjunction, such as before, when, because, even though, although, or since. And 3. The group of words work together as a single adverb that modifies a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. The best known function of an adverb clause is modifying a verb, and it is this type of adverb clause that is sometimes confusing in terms of punctuation. Thus, we focus on this function of an adverb clause. What's the problem? Adverb clauses by themselves pose few problems. They come easily to most people and frequently appear in speech and writing. The problem is whether to use a comma to separate the adverb clause from the rest of the sentence. 2 of the preceding examples use commas in this way, while the other 2 do not. Avoiding the problem, consider where the clause appears. In general, use a comma after an adverb clause that comes at the beginning of the sentence. Only rarely is a comma needed before an adverb clause. This hint will serve you well most of the time, but read the following sections to understand the exceptions, which do occur fairly often. Adverb clauses at the beginning of a sentence. Most adverb clauses can be placed in different positions in a sentence, and putting an adverb clause at the beginning of a sentence is common. Indeed, the resulting structure is simply one type of an introductory element. The same concept applies again in general. Use a comma to set off the introductory element, whether it is an adverb clause or some other type of introductory element. While I was reading a fascinating book on grammar, the electricity went out. Since our company was founded in 1902, the president has held an annual picnic for all employees. At one time, most grammar handbooks urge putting a comma after all adverb clauses that come at the beginning of a sentence. However, the trend now is that a writer can leave out a comma after a short adverb clause. Fewer than 5 words or so, most handbooks suggest. When Jane arrived, Tarzan was in the backyard. If Neil calls, we should not talk to him. In fact, you might find that some readers, especially in the business sector, prefer that you not use a comma after an introductory adverb clause unless the clause is long. This trend is growing, but most handbooks still indicate a preference for using a comma after introductory adverb clauses. Thus, we suggest you keep it simple whenever possible and put a comma after all introductory adverb clauses, short or long, unless you encounter readers who insist on leaving commas out. Adverb clauses at the end of a sentence. In general, do not use a comma before an adverb clause. Some people mistakenly use a comma in such situations simply because they feel a pause. This is especially the case with adverb clauses that begin with because. I incorrectly want to use a comma because I sense a pause in the sentence. Beefalo is what you get when you cross buffalo with cattle. Aluminum is cheap since it is the most common metal in the Earth's crust. To correct these errors, you merely need to omit the commas. I incorrectly want to use a comma because I sense a pause in the sentence. Beefalo is what you get when you cross buffalo with cattle. Aluminum is cheap since it is the most common metal in the Earth's crust. Why do we set off adverb clauses that appear at the beginning but not at the end of a sentence? A comma is used to set off an introductory clause so readers will have a clear sign as to where the real sentence begins. There is usually no other reason to set off an adverb clause, so avoid using a comma with an adverb clauses that appear anywhere else. But the hint noted earlier indicates that there is an exception, and here it is. Use a comma before the sentence-ending adverb clause when it deals with a strong sense of contrast. Such clauses usually begin with even though, while, although, or though. She was ready to leave the party immediately, while her husband wanted to stay all night. I remember that the Lone Ranger's horse is named Silver, though I keep forgetting that Tonto's horse is named Scout. It is not altogether clear why the rule evolved this way. Most likely, the comma helps readers see that the last part of the sentence will involve a strong contradiction or contrast with what came before. This structure is not rare in speech or writing, and overgeneralizing this situation causes many people to err by putting a comma before other types of adverb clauses. Again, the norm is that a comma should not set off a sentence-ending adverb clause. as with any rule, it can be broken when writers feel they want to emphasize an idea or achieve some other effect. But you should avoid intentionally breaking the rule in formal writing unless you are certain of a positive effect. Summary. Use a comma after an adverb clause that comes at the beginning of a sentence. You have the option of omitting the comma if the introductory clause is fewer than 5 words. Rarely should you use a comma before an adverb clause that comes at the end of a sentence. However, use a comma before the adverb clause if it involves a strong sense of contrast and begins with the words such as even, though, or although. Commas with appositives. An appositive is a noun or pronoun that renames another noun or pronoun. Most commonly, the appositive is a noun appearing almost immediately after another noun. Notice how the appositive seems to bend back to rename a previous noun. Appositives underline. My dog, Pearl, is a husky. Sherry talked to her lawyer, Perry Mason. An appositive phrase includes not only a noun, but words describing it. In this next example, president is the appositive, but it is described by the 29th and of the United States. All these words together are bending back to rename Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, the 29th president of the United States, said that automobiles symbolize the arrogance of wealth. Grammar tip, rewriting the sentence. To confirm an appositive, see if you can rewrite the sentence using only the appositive. If the rewrite is grammatical, you've confirmed the appositive. The example, my dog, Pearl, is a husky, could be written as, Pearl is a husky. What's the problem? As you have seen, appositives are frequently set off by commas. However, this is not always the case, as evidenced in these examples. My friend Nicole helped write this report. Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, was the inspiration for a 1956 movie called Forbidden Planet. Avoiding the problem is the appositive essential. Set off an appositive with commas unless the appositive is essential for identifying the word being named. Appositives with commas. Non-essential information is often set off by commas. This basic guideline applies to other types of grammatical structures as well. For instance, see commas with adjective clauses in this chapter. Although all appositives add clarity and detail, most are not crucial. Here, for example, the appositive underline clarifies exactly who the doctor is. I contacted our family physician, Dr. Stout. Assuming the writer has only one family physician, you could leave out the appositive and not confuse readers. Sure, they would not know the name of the doctor, but the appositive is not essential because the writer has only one family physician. The safest approach is to assume that an appositive needs commas, for usually the rest of whatever you are writing makes the appositive non-essential. Appositives without commas. In general, do not use commas to set off words that are essential to overall meaning of a sentence. The problem is sometimes it seems every word is important. However, as discussed earlier, the key with the positives is to look at the words they rename and consider how confused readers would be without the appositive. And a positive is essential when readers must have it to understand which person, place, or thing you have in mind. In such cases, you must leave out the commas. My friend, Jewel, needs a ride. Confusion, which friend? We assume you have more than one. My friend Jewel needs a ride. You need to read the book, The Color Purple. Confusion, which book? There must be millions of books available. You need to read the book, The Color Purple. Here are more examples of appositives that correctly omit the commas. Note how each appositive eliminates confusion by reducing the various ways readers could interpret each sentence. The children's song, Ring Around the Rosie, originated during the bubonic plague. The country Denmark has had the same national flag longer than any other nation in history. The French ruler, Napoleon Bonaparte, knowingly financed his Russian invasion with counterfeit money. Sometimes it can go either way. On a few occasions, an appositive might be essential or not, depending on what readers already know about the word being renamed. Consider again this sentence. It is fine as written if it could only be referring to one dog. My dog, Pearl, is a husky. Okay, if the writer has only one dog. But what if the writer has more than one dog? The appositive is essential because we are not sure which dog the writer has in mind. In this case, the appositive should not be set off by commas. My dog Pearl is a husky. Okay, if the writer has more than one dog. As you can see, the matter is usually settled by what the writer stated in previous sentences or by what the reader knew even earlier. Summary. And a positive is a noun or pronoun that renames a previous noun or pronoun. In general, use commas to set off appositives and leave out the commas, however, when the positive is needed in order to prevent confusion.